Welcome back to the deep dive. We have a file on the desk today that is, without any exaggeration, one of the most difficult documents we have ever had to analyze.
It really is.
It's a story that fundamentally changes how you look at the history of medicine and maybe even the history of the post-war world. We're not just talking about a dark chapter or, a few bad apples.
No, not at all.
We are talking about a systemic, bureaucratic failure that was meticulously documented by the perpetrators themselves.
It is heavy, and I think it's important to frame this correctly right from the start. Usually when we look at the post-World War II era, specifically that window between 1946 and 1948, we're conditioned to see the good war narrative.
Right, the heroes coming home.
Exactly. We see the Nuremberg Trials happening in Germany.
Mm.
We see the United States leading the charge to prosecute Nazi doctors for just horrific human experimentation. We see the birth of the Nuremberg Code, the foundation of all modern bioethics.
Never again without consent. That was the slogan, right? That was the moral high ground the United States was supposedly standing on.
Supposedly.
Yeah.
But the source material we're analyzing today, this comprehensive report, The Architecture of Impunity, it reveals a jarring, almost impossible counter-narrative.
It's like a parallel universe.
It is. At the exact same moment that American prosecutors are in Nuremberg condemning Nazi science, the United States Public Health Service, the PHS, is operating in Guatemala, and they are secretly infecting over 1,300 people with syphilis and gonorrhea.
And just to be absolutely clear for you listening, this wasn't observing a disease in the wild. This wasn't a passive study where they found sick people and, just tracked them.
No, that is the critical distinction. That was Tuskegee, which we'll get to. This was different.
Yeah.
Here, they were manufacturing the epidemic. They were taking prisoners, soldiers, psychiatric patients, and orphans, and they were intentionally, deliberately exposing them to venereal disease.
They were bringing the bacteria to the patient.
They were the vector.
The central figure in these documents is a man named Dr. John Charles Cutler. And I think the easy route here, the simple narrative, is to paint him as some kind of cartoon villain, right? The mad scientist in the jungle, operating in total secret.
Right, a Dr. Moreau figure.
Exactly. But the Architecture of Impunity argues something much more disturbing. It argues he wasn't a monster, he was a bureaucrat.
He was a bureaucrat of ambition. And that, I think, is the core question we really need to answer in this deep dive. How? How do a civilized medical establishment, and we're talking from the Surgeon General of the United States all the way down to the local health officers in Guatemala, how do they justify this?
What was the thought process?
Yeah. How did ideology, careerism, and Cold War geopolitics all converge to make the ethically impossible possible?
So let's get into the mechanics of it, because the documents, they show that Guatemala wasn't actually Plan A, it was Plan B.
That's right.
This entire operation actually got its start in the American Midwest.
Right. To understand Guatemala, you have to first understand the failure at Terre Haute. This was between 1943 and 1944. The PHS was running experiments at the federal penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana.
So on U.S. soil.
On U.S. soil in a federal prison. The war was raging, and the PHS was laser-focused on solving a specific military problem.
Gonorrhea.
Can you contextualize that for us? Why was gonorrhea such a high priority? It doesn't seem like, a battlefield wound.
You have to look at the military reality of the time. STDs were a massive, massive drain on manpower. We're talking about entire divisions being combat ineffective because so many men were on sick call.
Wow.
They saw it as a threat on par with, say, a supply line being cut, so they wanted to test prophylaxis. Basically, if a soldier gets exposed to gonorrhea, say, he goes into town on leave and visits a prostitute, is there a chemical, a pill, or a cream we can give him after exposure but before the infection takes hold?
Like a morning after pill for STDs.
That's a great way to put it. They were looking for a chemical shield to keep the soldiers fighting. So they go to Terre Haute prison. Now, what about consent there? Was it a factor?
Technically, yes. On paper. The prisoners were volunteers. They were offered money, I think it was around $100, which was a lot back then.
For a prisoner, yeah.
And they were given these certificates of merit that they were told might help with their parole hearings. So it was coerced consent in the sense that a prison environment is inherently coercive, but they did sign forms.
Okay, so they have their subjects. What was the experiment?
The PHS tried to infect these prisoners using what they call artificial inoculation. They were injecting live gonorrheal strains directly into the urethra of the penis.
And it fails.
It was a scientific disaster. And this is a really technical nuance, but it's so important because it dictates everything that happens later in Guatemala. The bacterial strains they were using, specifically one called the Burdick strain, It lost its virulence in the lab culture.
It got weak.
It got weak. Exactly. When you grow bacteria in a petri dish for too long, for generation after generation, it sometimes forgets how to attack a living human host. It gets soft.
It's not in a hostile environment anymore.
Precisely. So they couldn't get a consistent infection rate. Sometimes they'd inject a man and his own immune system would just fight it off naturally. Other times the bacteria was just too weak to do anything. Their data was a mess.
So the big variable they couldn't control was nature. Nature was just too messy for their data set.
That's the perfect way to phrase it. Dr. Cutler and his superiors, especially a man named Dr. John Mahoney, who is a big name in venereal disease research, they realized that relying on lab-grown strains in a regulated U.S. prison was just too unpredictable.
They couldn't control all the variables?
Not at all. They needed a higher, more reliable infection rate to prove their prophylaxis actually worked.
Yeah.
Think about it. If you give a man a pill and he doesn't get sick, was it the pill or was it just that the injection failed? You don't know.
Right, you can't prove a negative.
You can't. They needed a model where infection was guaranteed, or as close to it as possible, 100% of the time.
So instead of the logical conclusion, which would be, this is too difficult and ethically fraught, let's stop, they said, we need a better lab.
We need a new location. We need total control. And you have to remember, by 1946, the legal landscape in the U.S. was starting to shift.
Yeah.
Public opinion was slowly turning against human experimentation.
The war was over. The urgency was maybe a little less.
Exactly. You couldn't just grab people off the street. And even using prisoners was becoming a potential liability. They needed what they called a virgin population in a place where the American rules simply didn't apply.
Which brings us to section 1 of our outline. Why Guatemala? The report lays out 3 very specific pillars that made Guatemala the perfect, and I use that word in its most cynical sense, the perfect target.
It was a very calculated selection. The first pillar was what the report calls the legal vacuum. Guatemala in the 1940s just didn't have the emerging strict laws on informed consent or civil liability that were starting to bubble up in the U.S. legal system.
So if you hurt someone in an Indiana prison, you might get sued.
You might. Their family might sue. A newspaper might find out. In Guatemala, there was no legal mechanism for a prisoner or a psychiatric patient to sue the government of the United States. It was a legal black hole for them.
Okay, and the second pillar?
Access. Pure and simple access. They needed a population that was under strict state control. They couldn't have subjects just walking away halfway through the study.
So they needed institutions.
Exactly. Prisons, army barracks, and crucially for the later phases of the experiment, asylums. They needed people who literally could not say no, could not walk away. They needed a captive audience in the most literal sense of that term.
And the third pillar was the political cover. This one is fascinating.
Yeah, this is political complicity. And it's really interesting because it involves the Guatemalan government of the time, which was led by a man named President Juan Jose Arevalo.
Now, Arevalo wasn't a dictator, was he?
No, not at all. He wasn't a villain in his own story. He was a revolutionary. He was part of the October Revolution that overthrew a dictator. He wanted to modernize the country, build schools, and enact labor reforms. He was desperate to show the world that Guatemala was a modern scientific nation and to strengthen ties with the Americans.
So when the PHS came knocking, he saw an opportunity.
He threw the door wide open. He and his health minister thought this would bring modern medicine to their country. They thought they were getting access to American expertise and to the new wonder drug, penicillin.
And in return, Cutler got his open-air laboratory.
That's the phrase the documents use. It's so chilling. In Terre Haute, Cutler had to deal with wardens who had rights and lawyers who might ask questions. In Guatemala, he had carte blanche. Total freedom.
Okay, so they have the location. They have the subjects. But I want to drill down into the mindset here. You mentioned earlier that Cutler didn't view himself as a criminal. He saw himself as a pioneer. Where does that level of cognitive dissonance come from? This brings us to the ideology of scientific racism that's detailed in the source material.
This is the intellectual engine of the entire abuse. It's what makes it all possible in their minds. The report traces the institutional lineage of the PHS leadership men, like Surgeon General Hugh Cumming and his successor Thomas Perrin, who is a huge public figure.
A famous public health advocate, ironic.
Incredibly ironic. And a shocking number of the men in charge of these decisions, the men who signed off on this, they all attended the same medical school, the University of Virginia.
And at that time, UVA wasn't just any medical school. It was a major hub for the eugenics movement.
It was the epicenter of race medicine in the American South. The curriculum explicitly taught that different races had fundamentally different biological constitutions, that they weren't just culturally different, but physically different in ways that made them, inferior.
Inferior in what way?
Well, it's a deeply perverse paradox. On one hand, they were viewed as degenerate.
Huh.
They taught that black people in the U.S. or indigenous and Ladino populations in Latin America were inherently more susceptible to diseases like syphilis because of perceived moral failings, promiscuity, lack of hygiene, all the classic racist tropes.
So they blamed the victims for the disease.
Right. But simultaneously, and this is the absolute key to understanding Cutler, because they were viewed as lesser, they were also considered the ideal subjects for experimentation. The documents use a chilling term that it stops you in your tracks. They called them human passage material.
Human passage material. That sounds industrial, like a raw material.
It is. It's a term of logistics, not medicine. It frames the human body not as a patient to be cured, but as a filter, a conduit, a piece of lab equipment.
So what does that mean to passage a disease?
The idea was that you could take a weak, lab-grown strain of bacteria, like the one that failed in Terre Haute, and make it stronger by passing it through a living host. You infect a person, let the bacteria multiply in their body, and then you harvest that now strengthened bacteria from their sores or fluids to use on the next subject.
So you're using a human being to brew a stronger disease.
Exactly. And the material you use for this is, of course, the lesser population. You pass the disease through these disposable bodies to perfect the cure, which is then reserved for the valuable population, meaning white Americans and specifically the U.S. military.
So when Cutler looked at a Guatemalan prisoner, he didn't see a patient in pain. He saw a test. He saw a variable.
His own diaries and notes confirm this. He was obsessed with racial classification. He would meticulously note if a subject was pure Indian or Ladino, which means mixed race. He wasn't tracking their pain or their humanity. He was tracking their racial variables for his dataset.
That explains the lack of empathy. It wasn't that he was necessarily a sociopath in his personal life, but that his professional training demanded this kind of scientific detachment.
It was a professional requirement. If you empathized with the material, you were being sentimental. You were a bad scientist.
And that kind of detachment, that dehumanization, it allowed them to rationalize the geopolitical aspect of this too, because this wasn't just science for science's sake. It was defense. It was the Cold War.
Context is everything here. We have to look at the doctrine of hemispheric defense. After World War I, and especially during World War II, the U.S. military leadership was terrified of venereal disease.
You mentioned it took men out of action.
In some units during World War I, STDs were responsible for more lost man days than enemy fire. It was seen as a genuine national security threat, an enemy within that could decimate the Army's manpower.
So the stated goal of the Guatemala experiments was never, ever to help the people of Guatemala.
Never. Not once. The documents are crystal clear on this. The goal was to secure the health and combat readiness of the American soldier. They wanted to answer that one question. If a GI goes into town in, say, occupied Germany or Japan and visits a sex worker, can we give him a pill or a shot afterward to keep him in the fight?
The Guatemalans were just the proxy for that GI. They were the stand-ins.
They were the stand-ins. And to hide this military objective, to give it a veneer of legitimacy and benevolence, they used a cover organization, the Pan American Sanitary Bureau.
The PASB. Tell us about them.
The PASB. Today we know them as the Pan American Health Organization, or PAHO, which does a lot of great public health work. But in the 1940s, the documents describe them as, for all intents and purposes, an operational arm of the U.S. Public Health Service. The Surgeon General of the U.S. was often the director of the PASB. It was a revolving door.
So it was just a shell game, a way to move money around?
Essentially, the National Institutes of Health, the NIH, would funnel grant money to the PAC. The PASB would then spend that money in Guatemala under the official banner of Inter-American Sanitary Cooperation. It looked like benevolent aid. Look, we're helping our Latin American neighbors study infectious disease.
But in reality, the PASB was just the logistics department for Cutler's experiment.
Yes, they helped smuggle the supplies. They moved penicillin, lab equipment, and even the live bacterial strains through customs without any questions. They also offered fellowships and training opportunities to local Guatemalan doctors to, buy their silence or, in some cases, their enthusiastic cooperation.
It was a master class in using soft power, but it was weaponized.
Absolutely. It was the velvet glove on an iron fist of exploitation.
Okay, let's move to section 4. The anatomy of the horror. We've talked about the why and the where. We now need to talk about the how. And the report breaks this down into phases, and honestly, This is where I need to warn you, if you're listening. It gets very graphic.
It does. Cutler's experiments weren't static. They went through these distinct phases as he got more and more desperate for clean data. He started with phase 1, what he called normal exposure. He tried to mimic the natural way people get STDs.
Which involved state-sponsored prostitution. I still can't quite believe that's a real phrase.
It's hard to wrap your head around. The United States government, using taxpayer funds from the NIH, hired sex workers in Guatemala. They specifically selected women who were already infected with gonorrhea or syphilis.
And paid them.
They paid them. I believe it was only a few dollars per encounter. And they paid them to enter the prisons and the army barracks to have sex with the designated inmate subjects.
So they were procuring sex for prisoners specifically to spread disease.
And timing it. It was all about the data. They would have the men have sex, then they would wait for specific intervals, 2 hours, 4 hours, 8 hours, before administering the experimental penicillin prophylaxis. They wanted to find the absolute time limit of the cure.
But just like in Terre Haute, this method failed him.
It failed statistically.
Yeah.
Nature was too messy, the transmission rates were too low and unpredictable. You can have sex with an infected partner and not contract the disease. It's a probability game.
And Cutler wasn't interested in probability.
He was a man of statistics. He needed certainty. He couldn't wait around for probability. He needed a 100% infection rate to prove his hypothesis beyond any doubt.
So he escalated. This leads to phase 2.
The shift from, let's say, helping nature along to forcing nature. This is where they moved to direct inoculation. They called it artificial exposure, but the method was just brutal. They use a technique called scarification.
Can you describe that for us? What does that entail?
They would take a prisoner or a soldier. They would abrade the skin of the genitals, literally scrape it with a needle or a small scalpel until it was raw and bleeding. They wanted to create an open wound, a direct entry point for the bacteria.
My God.
Then they would take a pledget of cotton that had been soaked in a solution containing live syphilis spearheaded, or, in other cases, gonorrhea pus harvested from another infected subject.
And they would apply that directly to the open wound.
Yes, and they would leave it there for over an hour sometimes. The notes indicate they would sometimes wrap the penis in wax paper to create a moist chamber to ensure the bacteria survived and entered the bloodstream and lymphatic system.
How on earth did he justify that? That isn't science, it's torture.
Cutler's notes are incredibly revealing here. He had a rationalization for everything. He claimed in his reports that he was merely simulating the micro-traumas of rough sexual intercourse.
You're kidding.
Not at all. He argued that during any sexual act, there are tiny tears and abrasions in the skin. So, in his mind, scraping a man's penis until it bled wasn't assault. It was just standardizing the variables of sex. He convinced himself he was just replicating biology in a controlled setting.
That is a terrifying rationalization. But phase 3 is where any pretense of consent, even the coerced kind, completely evaporates. The asylum.
The Asilo de Alienados. This was a state-run psychiatric hospital. In the prison, you could make the flimsy argument that the men were coerced, but maybe technically agreed to participate for cigarettes or better food.
Right, there was some transaction.
In the asylum, you are dealing with patients who, by medical and legal definition, lacked the capacity to consent. They were vulnerable in the most absolute and profound sense.
And Cutler viewed them as the path of least resistance.
He viewed them as the perfect subjects, total targets. Since he couldn't effectively use prostitution there, many of the patients were too sedated or confused or catatonic. He went straight to the most invasive forms of inoculation.
And because he wanted to study neurosyphilis, the way the disease attacks the brain, he didn't just stick to the genitals.
No. This is where it becomes a horror film. They performed lumbar punctures, spinal taps, to inject syphilis spearheaded directly into the spinal fluid.
So directly into the central nervous system.
Directly into the central nervous system. They injected it into the cisterna magna, that's the fluid-filled space at the very base of the skull, right near the brainstem. They injected gonorrhea pus into the urethra and the rectum. And in some cases, they even injected syphilis into the eye sockets of patients.
Into the eyes. For what possible reason?
To see if they could induce a systemic infection through the mucous membranes of the eye. It was pure exploratory cruelty disguised as research. There was no therapeutic goal whatsoever.
It's just data collection at any human cost.
And then they engaged in what they called reinfection. This might be the most cynical part of all.
Yeah.
They would successfully cure a patient with penicillin. They would verify the cure with blood tests, and then they would infect them all over again with a different strain.
To test immunity.
To test immunity and to reuse the subject. They treated these human beings as if they were reusable Petri dishes.
There was no endpoint for the patient's well-being. The only endpoint was the completion of the data table.
Exactly. And then there were the children, phase 4.
This was at the orphanages and the state-run schools.
Yes. Now, to be fair, the evidence that we have indicates they didn't intentionally infect the children with syphilis like they did the adults, but they used them for serology, for blood testing.
Which, on the surface, sounds harmless compared to the rest of this.
It sounds it, but it wasn't a simple finger prick. They needed large volumes of negative baseline blood. That means blood from people they knew for certain didn't have syphilis, so they could calibrate their lab tests.
They needed a control group.
A control group of blood, yes. So they were performing invasive blood draws on these terrified orphans and school children. And the record suggests that to get the volume they needed quickly, they sometimes drew blood from the jugular vein in the neck on children. They subjected these kids to a terrifying and traumatic procedure purely to calibrate their laboratory equipment. They needed pure blood to set the dial on their machines to 0.
The scale of the complicity here is what gets me, which is section 5 of our outline. Cutler couldn't have done this alone. He was writing letters, he was filing reports, he was sending samples. Who was reading them back in the States?
That's the architecture part of the report's title. It was a whole system. Cutler was the hands in Guatemala, but the brain was in Washington, D.C. and in Staten Island. He reported directly to Dr. R.C. Arnold and his mentor, Dr. John F. Mahoney, at the Venereal Disease Research Laboratory. And at the very top of that chain of command was the Surgeon General, Thomas Perrin.
Perrin is a giant in American public health history. They put him on a postage stamp. He's famous for fighting syphilis publicly, for destigmatizing it.
He is. He wrote a book called Shadow on the Land. He was a crusader. But the documents show he tacitly authorized this secret abuse. He knew. His signature is on the grant renewals. And his underlings, Arnold and Mahoney, they actively coached Cutler on how to keep it all quiet.
And that's where we get the smoking gun letter.
Yes. There is a specific letter that has been preserved in the archives that really changes the legal interpretation of this entire history. It takes it from negligence to conspiracy.
What does the letter say?
Cutler is writing back to Arnold. He's a little worried about the paper trail they're creating, sending reports back and forth. He's worried about leaks. And he writes, quote, "It's unfortunate that we must work in a way so guarded, even subterranean, but it seems necessary."
Subterranean.
That one word is critical. In legal terms, it proves mens rea dilti mind, criminal intent. A common defense for historical abuses is, oh, it was a different time, they didn't know any better, the ethics were different.
Right, judging the past with the standards of today.
Exactly. But this letter proves they did know better. They knew that if the American public or the press found out about this, it would be a massive scandal. They knew it violated the ethical standards of their own time, the very standards being codified in Nuremberg at that exact moment.
So they didn't hide it because of national security against the Soviets. They hid it because they knew it was wrong.
Precisely. They chose the subterranean path not to protect the nation, but to protect the institution of the public health service from accountability.
And it wasn't just Americans who were complicit. We have to talk about the Guatemalan doctors.
Absolutely. Dr. Juan Funes. He was the head of the local STD division in Guatemala. And it's really important not to strip him of his agency here. He wasn't just a passive victim of American imperialism. He was an active and enthusiastic collaborator.
What was his motivation?
He saw this as a golden ticket for himself and for his country's medical establishment. By working with the Americans, he got access to penicillin, which was a miracle drug. He got access to modern training, to new lab equipment. He thought he was modernizing Guatemalan medicine.
So for him, the ends justified the means.
Ambition is a universal language. He was so proud of the work, he even co-authored and published a paper on the research in a medical journal in 1952, long after Cutler had left.
Unbelievable. So 1948 comes around, the study wraps up. Cutler packs his bags and leaves. But the experiment doesn't really end there, does it? The biological trail continues.
That's right. This is section 6, the aftermath. The human bodies were left behind in Guatemala, many of them untreated, but the biological assets, as they were seen, came home to the U.S.
What do you mean by that?
They shipped hundreds, maybe thousands of samples, vials of blood, tubes of spinal fluid, even preserved tissue from autopsies they performed. They shipped it all back to the labs in the United States.
And this is where the story connects to the other great shame of the U.S. Public Health Service, the Tuskegee syphilis study.
The connection is direct, and it is physical. The samples from Guatemala were sent to the very same labs, the Venereal Disease Research Laboratory, first in Staten Island as later in Chamblee, Georgia, that were processing all the blood work from the Tuskegee syphilis study.
Just to remind listeners who might not know the details, Tuskegee was the study where the PHS let hundreds of black men in Alabama die of syphilis, withholding treatment for decades just to watch the progression of the disease.
Yes, in Tuskegee they withheld the cure. In Guatemala they caused the infection. They are two sides of the same debased coin. And the samples, the physical blood and tissue, were handled by the same researchers in the same labs.
So to the PHS, the vial of spinal fluid from a psychiatric patient in Guatemala and the vial of blood from an Alabama sharecropper were just interchangeable.
They were just data points in a global map of what they saw as non-white pathology.
And this all stayed buried. For 60 years, how did it finally come to light?
It was a complete accident of history. A historian at Wellesley College named Susan Riverby, she was the one who wrote the definitive book on Tuskegee.
Okay.
She was in the archives at the University of Pittsburgh in 2010, going through Dr. John Cutler's papers for a separate project, and she just stumbled upon the Guatemala files, box after box of them.
She found the subterranean letters.
She found everything. The receipts for the sex workers, the lab notes on spinal injections, the letters. And to her immense credit, she didn't just sit on it for a big book deal. She immediately understood the gravity of it and alerted the U.S. government.
And that led to the public apology. I remember this. President Obama called the president of Guatemala. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton issued a joint statement. It was a massive news story for about a week.
For about a week, yes. But an apology isn't justice. An apology doesn't pay for medicine. And this is where the report's title, The Architecture of Impunity, proves that it is still standing today.
You're talking about the lawsuit, Garcia v. Sebelius?
Exactly. The surviving victims and their descendants filed a class action lawsuit against the United States government. They didn't want just words, they wanted compensation. They wanted the U.S. to pay for the decades of medical damage and the immense generational trauma.
And the U.S. government, the very same government that had just apologized and admitted this was ethically impossible, what did it do in court?
The Department of Justice fought the lawsuit tooth and nail. They invoked a legal doctrine called sovereign immunity.
Can you explain that concept for us?
In its simplest form, it comes from the Old English common law idea that the king can do no wrong. In U.S. law, specifically under a law called the Federal Tort Claims Act, it means the government generally cannot be sued for actions that were committed outside the borders of the United States.
So because they stepped across the border into Guatemala to commit these acts, they were legally untouchable.
That was the government's argument. And the judge, in the end, agreed. In his ruling, you can tell he was clearly torn. He called the experiments a deeply troubling chapter in American history, but he concluded that legally his hands were tied. He wrote that he was powerless to provide any redress.
It's infuriating. You have an admitted crime, you have proof of intent, you have names, dates, victims. But because of a procedural shield, a geographic technicality, there is zero legal accountability.
Zero legal accountability. The victims got a press release. And as the lawsuit pointed out, you can't pay for chemotherapy or long-term antibiotics with a press release.
Which brings us to the final part of this, the so what. Why does this story matter today in 2026? Why should you, listening, care about dusty files from 1946?
Because the fundamental power imbalance hasn't actually changed that much. This story explains so much of the deep-seated hesitation and distrust in the Global South regarding Western medical initiatives. When we see resistance to vaccines or clinical trials in parts of Latin America or Africa, we often dismiss it as ignorance or superstition.
But it's not superstition, it's memory, it's historical trauma.
It's history. They have a reason to be skeptical. They remember that Western medicine hasn't always come to heal. Sometimes it has come to extract. And that risk is still there. Today, we don't talk about open-air laboratories, but we talk about offshoring clinical trials.
You mean big drug companies running their tests in developing nations?
Exactly. And just look at the incentives. Why do major pharmaceutical companies conduct so many of their Phase 2 and Phase 3 trials in the developing world? Number one, lower costs. Number two, large drug-naive populations who haven't been taking a dozen other medications that could complicate the data. And number three,
less regulation.
Less stringent regulation. Those are the exact same three reasons that Cutler and the PHS went to Guatemala 75 years ago.
It's identical. Legal vacuum, access, and cost. It's what the report calls the neo-colonial risk.
The actors have changed. It's multinational corporations now, not just the Public Health Service,
right,
but the basic architecture of using the Global South as a proving ground for the Global North is still very much intact.
That is a deeply terrifying thought.
And that brings me to the final provocation for you to think about. We have institutional review boards now, bioethics boards. We have mountains of paperwork to sign. We have informed consent. But we have to ask ourselves a really hard question. Is modern bioethics actually protecting the patient? Or has it become a form of institutional risk management?
Is the paperwork there to protect me from harm, or is it there to protect the hospital from me suing them?
That's the question, exactly. If the legal system, as we saw with sovereign immunity, ultimately protects the institution over the victim, has the underlying architecture that allowed Cutler to operate with impunity actually been dismantled? Or have we just put a nicer, more bureaucratic facade on it?
That is a heavy question to end on, but I think it's the right one. We can't just say never again and then move on. We have to look at the structures, the systems of power that made then possible, and ask honestly if they are still standing in the shadows of now.
Because the price of ethical science is eternal skepticism of power. Always.
This has been the deep dive into the Guatemala experiment. Thank you for listening, and thank you for guiding us through this incredibly difficult file.
It's a story that had to be told.
We'll see you on the next deep dive. Take care.